welcome, Roger, to this little interview. It's very exciting. I'm sure everyone's looking forward to the concert at the Concourse in Chatswood this coming Sunday, the 11th of December. And Chatswood, certainly a place that's been a part of your life, isn't it?
Well, I was born there just because it was in Boundary Street at Bel Air. I just made it because Roseville was at the back of the hospital. I went to school, Chatswood Primary. I went to for piano lessons, like my brother and my two sisters did, with Miss Pope in 1 Sable Street. I still remember her phone number, JA8170.
Yeah.
It was the time when you dialed JA.
Yeah, we had the letters at the start. Yeah.
People always just called themselves by picked up the phone and they'd use their surnames. But I can't come to terms with the fact now that such a gentle lady would say Pope.
Yes, yeah. And then you did also go to the Conservatorium High School?
Yes, but our school speech days were in Chatswood Town Hall, which is now the Concourse. And I played for the school on one occasion, but I accompanied the choir. My dad sang in the Ku-ring-gai male voice choir, and we all went to hear him and his mates. That was just after the war. They got together. So it was very much, we played in that oval, which is just off Albert Avenue at the back of the station. And then the Lane Cove Park, one end of it was at the bottom of our street where we lived, and it was so I'm a kind of a Chatswood boy, although I look at it now and it's become this city, this huge place with this magnificent concourse. Really is something.
It is, the lovely concert hall, yeah. Well, I remember there was quite a legendary headmistress of that Conservatorium High School when I was there, Betsy Brown.
I had her too.
Yes. Yeah. And she actually retired in my last year there, I think it was. Yeah, Betsy. And she'd been a teacher there, I think, since the 1940s or something.
She was the best of the best.
Oh yeah, she was good.
I had of her history and geography.
I remember soon after the Sydney Opera House opened, the New York Philharmonic was on a tour with Leonard Bernstein conducting, and Betsy heard that they were rehearsing it was a weekday because we were at school. They were having a rehearsal in the concert hall in the morning. She cancelled all the classes and sent the entire school down to the Opera House. And I remember as a 16-year-old sitting right in front of Leonard Bernstein, conducting in front of me. She knew what the school was about.
He had this incredible sense of rhythm, which brought those Mahler vistas to life. Instead of being pictorial, they had this incredible rhythmic structure behind them. He was just magnificent. I'm sorry I didn't ever work with him.
Brilliant musician, yeah. And then when you went to the Conservatorium and you had Straczynski as teacher.
I was lucky because until that time I'd been preparing to be a church musician and studying organ and choral music at St Andrew's Cathedral with Kenneth Long. Then suddenly, at Goosens in those years prepared the Sydney Symph for those festive occasions, Easter and the feasts in Easter and Christmas. So you'd have either the Christmas oratorio of Bach, or you would have one of the Passions, St John or St Matthew Passions, and participating in those just
I can imagine,
just something for a little boy. But Goosens prepared those concerts, so I sat in on the first row. It was the first time I was ever in St Andrew's Cathedral. I saw Goosens preparing the SSO for the St Matthew Passion. I'll never forget it. And it was because I was lucky enough to play for him, and he recommended me to Straczynski, that I got to work with Straczynski. But again, I just made it because Goosens suddenly wasn't there anymore, Kenneth Long was suddenly not there anymore. The whole place changed. And I knew that one sensed, as children do, that it was the end of some kind of golden era or renaissance or something. You're Italian, you know what the how
Yes,
important the Renaissance. So you gave the world the Renaissance.
Yeah.
So, it was an incredible period of music making that just suddenly wasn't there. And I found myself in the school, this Conservatorium High School, and none of those people were around anymore who started me off. And so it was like I was suddenly exposed to Alexander Svrjensky, and he was a tyrant, as we all know. And so I, by default, became a pianist.
And did you think, looking back now in terms of piano teaching, when you think back to him and piano teaching now, do you notice big differences?
You know, Zbigniew Drzewiecki at the Chopin Academy was also my teacher. And although Svrjensky and Drzewiecki were both very fine teachers, it's really the students who teach you everything. If I was willing to learn from my students, so I was receptive to what their needs were, and I was able to adapt what I learned to their needs. I think that was more important. So I was able to learn a lot from teaching, and I found it. I've been teaching all my life since the age of 16, out of necessity in Sydney as a young student. Because Svrjensky's fees were just so horrifically expensive.
Okay. Yeah.
There was only one person who was paid more than he was making, and that was Goossens. And as his detractors were very fond of pointing out, he earned more money than the Prime Minister from his job as chief conductor of the SSO and the Conservatorium.
Right. So he was working for the ABC as well as the Conservatorium.
Although it's not fair, that criticism, because it was two jobs.
Yes, yeah.
But it was just the idea that a musician was earning more than the top politician. It was somehow not acceptable for those people at that time who were calling the shots.
I think you also had some composition lessons with Raymond Hansen, because I remember Raymond Hansen very well.
Yes. Were you in his oral?
I wasn't actually in his class. I was at the high school there, but I remember him because at that time the high school was an annex at the government house side of the old building, and the high school was upstairs, and on the downstairs part facing the courtyard was Raymond Hansen's room. And,
that's right, at the back of all those cupboards which took long double basses.
Yeah.
No, we had the same. That was where we had oral training. He'd come in a pair of sneakers from the jazz club, and he'd have a turquoise shirt with a canary yellow bow tie and a pipe.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and he'd he'd suddenly start playing Schumann from foreign lands and people, and show us all the little corners of how important cadences were. I was lucky enough to study with him composition. And the lessons turned into these philosophical diatribes, and I didn't have a watch to check the time, but I knew I was going to miss my train, and I just couldn't tell him, "Could you shut up and get on with it? Because I've got to get home." But he just opened up to his students, and that was the part that was really the lesson, which was really terribly important. He's a great teacher.
Yes, and he sort of followed a path that was his own, really, as a composer, didn't he? He didn't really fit in, and so he didn't get that recognition, perhaps.
Tell me, when you were in trouble at school, if you ever were, I was constantly at the conservatory, we were told to stand on the roof.
Oh, right.
And I was outside Hilda Mulligan's studio, and she had this huge sky blue painted door and this entire grey kind of mausoleum.
Right. Yeah.
Green and cream conservatorium. Right. There was a kind of official colours.
No, we didn't. We were just sent round to Betsy Brown's office most of the time, I think.
Betsy always carried a stick with a box, an empty chalk box with things in it, with a chalk that you actually got in your fingernails, but she never used. The stick was only about this long. Yeah. But it was a symbol of authority. Yeah, but we all loved her so much.
Yeah. Yeah. And
We
so,
had good people.
yes, definitely, yeah. And so this Prokofiev piano concerto, you've had a long association with that piece, haven't you?
I played the first and the second more
Okay.
since I played this. But in 1963, when I did my diploma, the DSCM, it was then one of the 4 concertos we were allowed to play, and we had the full orchestra to play it with. And I chose that one because when I read through the pages, it seemed to express incredible exuberance and joy, and it had a wonderful feel about it. So I was able to learn it quickly, and I got in Swijansky's good books because of that, because he loved Prokofiev, and I think he introduced a lot of the works to Sydney. When the Sydney Symp was really starting out and finding its feet and so on, a little bit like the KPO at this moment which has reached an important plateau, and you have that feeling. But then the Prokofiev third, my fellow students were able to play it pretty well, and it was a very happy experience. So Swijansky, who told us we had to play in the ABC instrumental and vocal competitions, said you should play that next year was it 1960, the year after I got my diploma. So I did, and I won the damn thing. And the prize was a very good one. It was like the prizes that radios in Germany and Italy have, radio station prizes. We got to play with all the orchestras in Australia, which was a big deal then. Somebody starting out. There was a kind of multiple invitations, and then for radio and television as well. So it was a very useful prize. Swijansky knew this, but of course it was also for the greater gloria of Alexander Swijansky, you know. And he was a great teacher, a great visionary. Goossens loved him, Heinz loved him. His colleagues didn't. They didn't believe for a moment that he studied with Rachmaninoff or Silotti, although he did. There's proof enough. But his main studies were with Glazunov in Petrograd.
And you met Prokofiev's first wife too, didn't you?
Lena Prokofieva. When I was a student at the Chopin Academy, I was told to wait. I was respectful of authority there because it was behind the Iron Curtain at the time, and if your professor told you to wait, you really did. So I waited, and I thought I was going to get booted out or had committed some other atrocity or hadn't learned enough Chopin for that week or something. And he said, "You're going to play." He didn't announce it like it was a funeral, but he was kind of telling me, "This is pretty seriously, and you'd better get it right." So he said, "You've been chosen to play for a very important visitor," and I thought it was a politician. So you could be forgiven for thinking that behind the Iron Curtain at the time, but particularly because it was I was told to play a lot of Prokofiev, so. I played some Chopin, I played some Prokofiev. And when I came into this, it was a part of Warsaw. It was not very far from Professor Drzewiecki's apartment. It was very tall, very high ceiling. There was actually a servant, although they didn't call it, communists didn't call a person a servant. It was a house manager. I think it was some title like that. Conducted me in, and I was told to wait in this vestibule and then taken in. And there were some aging people who probably look like I do now. And there was this lady, very plain clothes with a lot of shopping bags. And you could buy things in Warsaw, you couldn't in Moscow then. And she's just come in from shopping. and I was told to come in, to bow, to say nothing, and to play. I played the Seventh Sonata. I played the Etudes Opus 2. Then we had a break. I played some Chopin, I think it was the Fourth Ballade. And she got up, and tears were in her eyes, and she hugged me, and she started telling me about, you play my husband's music like he did. And she couldn't have been talking about Chopin, of course. So it only left one contender. And anyway, it brought joy to her. And then I thought that was a very special remark until somebody told me, yeah, we knew it was Elena Prokofieva, and she says that about everybody who plays his music because she just loved anybody who played her husband's music. But she was a magnificent mezzo-soprano, and Prokofiev was very much in love with her, and the two sons came from her. We stayed in touch. She eventually got out from the Soviet Union, although she'd been in this terrible camp where people are sent for political offences. I think her offence was she was French. Well, she was originally Spanish, but a French citizen. And she'd been phoning friends during the war and for part of the war in France, and they hated her because she wasn't from there. And Prokofiev remarried. The boys were old enough to be able to cope with all this, but she was put in a camp for 8 years, which was a furnace in summer and terribly cold in winter. And I met her about 8 to 10 years after that. And coming to Warsaw was like going to the Riviera after you were living in Moscow. And although Poles wouldn't agree with that, but it had certain freedoms that were not in East Germany or not even in Hungary or Czechoslovakia. By the way, do you mind if I ask you a question?
No,
I didn't perform in Czechoslovakia or Denmark, and I noticed in your biography that you were directing there. Could you tell me a little bit about?
Yes, I went to Denmark in that was late 1988, and because I'd married a girl from Denmark who I met in Australia, and at the time when I was still in Australia, I was thinking of moving to Germany because of all the orchestras, but we met, and so we decided, well, it's right next to Germany anyway, so we'll go to Denmark first, and things went very well. So I got work quite quickly, and it was very, very good conditions for classical music in Denmark. So I was in the Danish chamber players for about 16 years. We did a lot of touring, and I was there actually just before the wall came down. So I was on touring quite a bit in that year up until the end of 1989 through East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and through there. And so I was, as I say, I was playing in the Danish chamber players, and we were touring South America and all over the place. And then it was while I was in Denmark that I became more interested in composition and conducting. It was an Australian production company who, a former student of the Con High School actually, who contacted me about, he was producing this big series on English, the history of English hymnody, English hymns. And I said, all right. And so he wanted me to develop the most well-known hymns into mini symphonic poems and, with choir and orchestra. And we ended up recording the first one in Prague, which had by then had just opened up to the West, and you could get a very, very good product for about a third of what it would cost in Los Angeles or in London. And so when I first went down to Prague, we ended up using the musicians who had been in a permanently employed film orchestra under communism. It had been disbanded officially after the wall came down, but you could still ring all the same musicians.
Yeah.
And so they would come, and they could sight read like unbelievably. We could get an entire CD of music done in a day. They were very, very good. And yes, you know that city of Prague has a wonderful Mozart tradition too. There's the contacts that were established there right from Mozart's time in Prague, where he was probably at his
The
most
Prague Chamber Orchestra I worked with, and they were wonderful.
wonderful. Yeah, because Charles McKerris did a lot of work there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uncle Charlie.
Yes, yeah. No, but and I ended up going down there about twice a year for 10 years or so to Prague, and also on some tours with the Danish Chamber Players when we play on one side of the border there from Poland and the Czech Republic. They had a little festival there, and so yeah, we did a lot of work in Eastern Europe, and it was, as you were alluding to before, it was a fascinating place in many ways.
Good musicians around then.
Yes, good musicians, but and it was very. In the West, we tend to think of behind the Iron Curtain was just one monolithic block or something, but each country was different from place to place. East Germany was a very strict place.
Some of the worst buildings, shabbiest buildings were there, but some of the best music making.
Yes, very good. Yeah.
In Dresden and Leipzig.
Dresden,
and
great tradition there.
I played in the old Gewandhaus.
Right. Yeah.
You could even hear the lines roaring.
Yeah.
When the Brahms D minor, when the timpanist was doing this. You hear the
Yes.
where the muzzle will be for the. But there's it's always interesting for me how people put I think in our own country, in Australia, that there's such emphasis put on the building of something new, and then people say, "Oh yeah, we've got to put some pianos in there." It's about the last consideration rather than. But I realised when I was playing in some of these places, East Germany and Poland, it was not important how shabby the building was, but how good the music making was.
Of course, yeah.
And when to finish the business about Lena, when she got to France, Trish and I visited her often, and then she moved to London, and I lost contact with her. But when the wall came down, she'd been dead since, I think, earlier that same year. The wall came down, 9th of November, 1989. And I think Lena passed away on January the 30th. But she was the most wonderful figure for many young musicians. It was not just me that he was singled out with some very lucky person, but she helped a lot. She worked with a lot of musicians. And so we both encountered a lot of really interesting personalities.
It was interesting when that wall came down, and so many orchestras were disbanded quite quickly in Eastern Europe. A lot of the musicians were seeking work, of course, in the West, and the West German orchestras did not really want to know them. And quite a few of them got work up in Scandinavia, and we had a wonderful...
felt very strongly about this.
We had a wonderful viola player from Krakow who ended up being in the Danish Chamber Players. He's still terrific. Yeah. And a lot of them got work in Sweden, Norway and Denmark. But it was I remember him telling me that...
Who did you actually study conducting with, if you don't mind my asking?
Only really indirectly from all the conductors that I managed to play with. I've never actually done a conservatorium degree in it.
No, you have a distinctive style. I was watching you yesterday with the Shostakovich Chamber Symphony and the Festive Overture, which is stunning, especially the brass player. The trumpeters were marvellous. But you have brought your whole style, and I was wondering where you were trained. And so now I know.
It was, mainly observing, And I was already doing it actually when I was...
Well, you wasted nothing. You reminded me of Rovitsky. To an extent.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to the Prokofiev with you.
So are we very much, yeah.
Congratulations on building the magnificent programs you did.
Thank you.
Tell me, do you mind if I ask you about this program with young composers? It's so impressive.
Well, the KPO started that, what they call their composer workshops, 2003 it started. And so they call for applications and they choose three each year, or now we have it every second year. And then a mentor is chosen from the established composers in Australia. Nigel Butley was the first, did the first couple of them. and Paul Stanhope has done some as well. And so then we give them, they're invited to write a piece for the orchestra. They get an orchestration, like a bit bigger than a classical orchestra, but not massive, not a Mahlerian orchestra. And so they write the piece, and then it's workshopped through 3 rehearsal evenings. And then, and recently, the girl whose work is on this concert on Sunday, Naomi Dodd, she was one of the 3 finalists 3 or 4 years ago.
Stunning work.
Yeah, she's very good. And since then, we commissioned another piece from her, which is the piece which will be on Sunday. And that was the piece she sent in to the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra for their composer workshop. And she's been one of the few chosen to be in that as well. So she's going very well. It's been very good for her. And another one we had before COVID, the last time we had it, Angus Davison is doing very well in Australia now too. But you've always been a proponent of not only promoting new music, but I remember when the music rostrum days when we had Luciano Berio in Sydney, we played
I had to sell perfume in David Jones from Estee Lauder. Yeah. She gave us money for that rostrum. Right. If I sold her perfume, I said, done, I'll do it. So I put on a suit and a tie. And there was something, I was playing Chopin mazurkas and saying that this particular perfume would be good for that mazurka and so on. And everybody knew that it was total bullshit, but we went ahead and did it anyway. And that's how I... But you played in the Xenakis Eonta,
yes.
Which is an incredibly difficult piece.
I remember it very
that's where I met you, introducing Xenakis to Sydney-siders in early 70s. And of course those concerts became eventually the Sydney Spring in the 90s. But thank you. It was stunning, your playing from that time.
Oh, thank you. That was in the old...
Now I know why those trumpeters in your orchestra are so good. They know they've got to shape up because you're actually a trumpeter.
Yeah, that was. I remember it in the old Verbruggen Hall, 1974, I think it was. Yeah. But you've also been active, not just promoting contemporary music, but by getting contemporary music onto programs that also have traditional repertoire in them, not just putting them off in a box somewhere.
Well, Spojensky's to blame for that because he believed passionately in putting the old next to the new. So I grew up thinking that was a natural thing to do. And Sydney had a lot of people who were way ahead of their time in the old con from the 50s and 60s and 70s. There were wonderful teachers around, and they were doing very interesting things. But Spojensky introduced that idea, and I stayed with it all my career, and it's a good thing. You end up thinking everything is new, even if it's old. So the old does become the new, and you play the new pieces from the traditions, and it results in a different kind of music making. And I think Australians were lucky like that, and it's one of the reasons Australians are hired so often to do new things and appointed to projects which are challenging and trying to achieve new things, because we think outside the box. And I think that's the way I grew up. We both grew up.
Yeah, Goossens himself introduced a lot of new music to Australia too, didn't he? Yeah.
Those Stravinsky performances of his were, I think, the most amazing. But the soloists, when Yehudi came, or Claudio Arau, or just stunning soloists we had in our youth.
Yes, there was some performance. I remember the ABC released a recording recently that it made of a performance of the Beethoven Ninth Symphony at the end of World War II, conducted by Eugene Ormandy in the Sydney Town Hall.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Which is absolutely wonderful. And they described that at the time they were sitting in a little room up in George Street somewhere while the concert was going on in the Town Hall. Well, I think it was one of the first big live broadcasts.
That's amazing.
And quite good quality
Ormandy.
too. Quite good quality. Yeah, Ormandy, yes, he conducted in, I know he conducted at least in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne during the war.
Because Goossens was in Cincinnati then, and he that's where Stravinsky heard him direct some of the early works, and Stravinsky swore that Goossens was the finest, whether some of the Loisir de Fer in particular. But there was essentially a lyric instrument. The SSO was a lyric orchestra. And he made, those Stravinsky textures were very fine. It's like a pen drawing of some kind. It's just so fine. And I can still hear those sounds. Oh, his Debussy was also exceptional.
Yes, he got the SSO some international releases there in the late 1940s.
It was its golden era, I think. And when they got rid of him, well, they didn't, but what was the Vice Squad?
That's right, the Vice
New
Squad,
South Wales government had a Vice Squad, and they got rid of him. A Vice Squad. It's unimaginable. But, on that note, it's not a good way to finish an interview. We should move on from this somehow. Well,
just a little bit about Prokofiev's music in general. I mean, I think most people, even fairly well-educated musicians, when they listen to Prokofiev, they can hear there's something very original about Prokofiev, but sometimes it's hard to define just what it is, what he does. What is
his
so
son,
effective?
Sviatoslav, was asked a question, what is it about your father's music that it seems to start off one way but goes another way? And the son said, well, he'd invent a melody, then he would Prokofievize it.
Yes. Well, quite often you get a modulation mid-phrase in Prokofiev. That's one of the things. Certainly. Yeah.
Like that jump with the piano entry of the inversion of the orchestral opening from C major to E flat minor. It's wonderful.
Yeah. The use of those augmented sixth chords, and it's sort of a similar way to the way jazz musicians use them, actually.
It's very nice to meet you again and to work with you again. The boot's on the other foot now. I'm not the conductor, you're the conductor.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure, Roger. So we're all looking forward to the concert. I think it'll be a great day on Sunday. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Can I throw in a couple of questions?
Yeah.
For someone who's in the audience and listening to this piece for the first time, what would you tell them to listen out for? How would you guide them?
Pretend you're on another planet and just something new might happen to you, and you might find bits of the past that you recognize, but just throw yourself open to what you might consider new, a new experience. Just be open and receptive to what it is you hear.
And one other random one. Of all the performances that you've given of this piece, which one sticks out in your mind the most?
With Paul Terracini.
Well, he had to say that, didn't he?
Yeah, it's all right. You can pay me later.
Yes.
No, there are. I don't know. People talk about my playing the third piano concerto. Yeah, I play the third piano concerto, and I played it for my diploma. But the second and the first are wonderful. In fact, my favourite one is the fifth. And more than the piano concertos, I really love the Sinfonia Concertante. That really is a great concerto. It's a symphony concerto. But all of the Prokofiev concertos, including the two violin concertos, they're wonderful works. But the third is very beautiful, and it has aspects about it that are memorable. But the first and the second and the fifth, the fourth is a left-hand piano concerto. But
we did the first several years ago. The first concerto with Lian Jin, and she's another a young student that KPO promoted. She's now on a big scholarship to Yale University, so she's doing very well. Yeah, she was a finalist in the KPO concerto competition. So we have the KPO runs a concerto competition and the composer workshops.
Tell me, how many years have you been doing that for the?
With the KPO?
Yes, the concerto competition.
I've done about 5 or 6, I think now. 5 or 6
And
years.
how long has it been going?
Oh, it's 1984, I think, wasn't it? In 1984
Good heavens.
we started.
It's
John-
the best
John-
possible way to pick out the top techniques
Yeah,
that are emerging from
yeah.
the field.
Yeah, there's some wonderful talent comes up there every year. Some of these young pianists and violinists as well.
Australia's amazing. It's just full of such phenomenal talent, wonderful musicians. I heard 2 of them in San Francisco. I was so stunned. I wrote a review of them, and which Limelight printed. And they both made very good careers too. Gavrilyuk, and there was a young man from Canberra. I can't remember his name now, but he's wrote to me from Tel Aviv, I think it was, and New York, and he's doing well.
Very good.